Chosen one. Being chosen doesn't always feel like a blessing. It feels like you're the target of everyone's emotional denial, shrouded in polite silence. Let's get real. People don't always fight you because you're incorrect. Sometimes people fight you because you are correct about them. A new behavioral psychology study found that people are more prone to lash out against persons they secretly like but feel emotionally unworthy of. Translation: that unpleasant tension, that unexpected explosion, that abrupt ghosting. Yeah, it was not arbitrary. It was an emotional earthquake, and you were its epicenter. They fought over you. They talked behind your back, as if it were a joint project. Why? Because you weren't just liked. You were a threat. You didn't enter the room looking to compete. You just were. You had no idea you were in a race. Yet somehow, you are the finish line. And let's be honest, nothing puzzles emotionally constipated people more than developing affections for someone who isn't playing the game. They didn't admit how they felt because doing so would expose the same thing they'd spent years pretending didn't exist: their true selves. So, what did they do? They argued, lied, projected, and possibly even formed an unholy union, all to deal with the cosmic injustice of your being remembered. So buckle on, because what you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart, and it's certainly not for the passive-aggressively obsessed. Let's go into the honest, raw, no-filter truth of why being the chosen one causes people to act out, even if all you did was turn up. And hey, if you've ever accidentally made someone fall in love with you simply by being emotionally available and slightly mysterious, congrats. You are a part of the problem. Number 1, you became a mirror and they despised their reflection. You did not just enter their lives, you interrupted it. When you arrived, something in them broke open, not because you said anything objectionable or because you tried too hard, but because your mere presence made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. You became a mirror, and the image they saw was not favorable. You did not represent their finest self. You reflected the image of them that they were avoiding. And that's where the conflict started. It was not your fault. You were simply being real. However, authenticity reveals everything else that is false. And they've spent years creating a version of themselves that they can accept. A version that plays it safe, sticks to the rules, smiles when they don't mean it, lowers their voice, and avoids conflict, particularly with oneself. Then you arrive with your unabashed energy, emotional clarity, and a presence that makes people wonder why they're pretending in the first place. They did not want to see that. They wanted to remain numb. But there you were, shining light on the portions of them that they had buried. You were not intending to challenge them, but you did. Without making an effort to help anyone, you became a walking contrast to their comfort zone. You revealed the lies they told themselves in order to sleep at night. They saw in you what they were frightened of becoming. Confident, expressive, and connected, it stung deep down. Not because you injured them, but because they couldn't stop seeing what you revealed. So, what did they do? They fought you. Not always directly. Sometimes it came in the form of backhanded compliments, subtle sabotage, or unexpected retreat. They couldn't stand up to themselves, so they blamed you for exposing their weaknesses. They despised what they saw in your reflection. Not because it was ugly, but because it was accurate. Nothing unsettles individuals more than watching someone who has the bravery to be what they are still afraid to be. Number 2, they liked you secretly because acknowledging it would cost them control. They did not remain mute because they felt nothing. They remained silent because feeling for you meant losing control. That terrified them more than anything. Admitting their feelings would have destroyed the cold, calculated image they've cultivated. It would have shown vulnerability. It would have represented honesty. Some people would sooner eat glass than be emotionally open, so they kept quiet, not to protect you, but to preserve their pride. The truth is, they felt everything: attraction, adoration, and perhaps even love. The kind that's inconvenient and noisy, but they buried it deep because saying it out loud would have granted you power. And individuals like that despise feeling powerless. Even in love, they want to have all of the cards, even if that means losing the game. They convince themselves you wouldn't mind, that you probably had someone else, and it wouldn't matter. But deep down, they knew they were making excuses, because if they truly believed you didn't matter, they wouldn't have spent so much time pretending you did. Their stillness was audible in all the wrong ways. Delayed responses, unusual tension, and random jealousy disguised as sarcasm. Every single action screamed what their mouth would not say. You got to them, and they remained far. Why? Because quiet allowed them to maintain control of the tale. If they never admitted anything, they would never have to face rejection, risk, or vulnerability. The joke is on them, though, because they still lost you. And not because of what they said, but because of what they left out. They thought silence would protect them, but all it did was create a barrier between them and the one person who could see them plainly. In order to safeguard their ego, they gave up their chance. They didn't abandon you because they weren't enough. They lost you because they were too terrified to admit who you were. Number 3, your energy disrupted their disguise. They were doing just great pretending to be happy, pretending to be okay, and pretending that the version of themselves they presented to the world was the true one. Then you strolled in, not loud or arrogant, but honest. And all of the masks they had been wearing stopped fitting. You did not expose them by calling them out. You exposed them simply by being yourself. You were authentic, emotionally present, and raw in ways they had never seen before. You didn't recoil at reality. You did not avoid hard conversations. You did not tone down your personality to make people feel at ease. And this is what made you dangerous. Not because you did anything to them, but because they couldn't do it on their own. They weren't prepared for someone who hadn't played the game. You were not trying to impress anyone. You didn't pretend to be perfect. And that made you both magnetic and annoying, because you showed them what life is like without a filter. You were comfortable with your imperfections. You owned your truth. And it left them standing there, their carefully crafted characters suddenly seeming phony, hollow, and insignificant. You interrupted their performance. They were well-mannered in every room they entered before you. They knew how to charm, blend in, and keep people at the appropriate distance. But you didn't follow the rules. You looked them in the eyes. You posed legitimate questions. You added depth. You made surface-level interactions seem useless. And that terrified them, since their entire identity was based on the surface. They began to pull away, push back, or throw subtle shade. Not because you harmed them, but because you exposed them. You didn't come to break them down, but your intensity left them with nowhere to hide. You did not destroy anything. You made it hard for them to continue living the lie, and, as someone who had spent years performing, your honesty felt like an earthquake. Number 4, you activated the version of themselves that they never became. You did not do anything to them personally. You did not brag. You did not brag. You weren't attempting to compete. However, your presence continued to make them nervous, not because you were too much, but because they were insufficient for themselves. You reminded them of the version of themselves they had always wanted to be, but had never achieved. And that type of reminder stings. They originally had grandiose aspirations of a bold, free, completely alive version of themselves, but they eventually settled for comfort, regularity, and safety. Then you arrived, maturing right in front of them, taking risks, expressing your truth, mending, and evolving. They weren't concerned by your accomplishment. It was the fact that you did not stick with them. They witnessed you become something they were too afraid to try. You didn't merely discuss change. You lived it. You did not simply say you deserved better. You acted like it. And as they watched you rise, it became increasingly difficult to pretend that their stagnation was acceptable. Believe the explanations they gave themselves were still valid, and that time was not passing them by. As a result, people began to pull away, or worse, throw shade. Because when people lack the confidence to progress, they take consolation in watching others fail. But you did not fail. You rose quietly and relentlessly, and your success made their inaction more difficult to ignore. It was not jealousy in the usual sense. It was grief. They were lamenting the version of themselves that they never become. And being near you intensified my grief. Every action you made reminded them that they could have made a different decision, that it was both feasible and not. So they directed their displeasure at you, not because you were the problem, but because you made their regrets impossible to silence. You were not the threat. You were the proof. Number 5, their attack involved a confession. They couldn't express how they felt, so they did it in the most twisted way possible. They started fires and called it distance. Tension, disagreements, and unexplained coldness were not simply manifestations of emotional immaturity. It was a disguised confession. Every jab, scathing remark, and mood change represented a warped sort of emotional touch. They didn't know how to handle the strength of their feelings for you. So they transformed connection into conflict because they cared more deeply than they wanted to. However, caring implied vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. Instead of opening up, they reacted aggressively. Their attack was not based on hatred. It was about the confusion that occurs when you have an overwhelming desire for someone and don't know what to do with it. When someone raised their voice, questioned you without reason, became strangely competitive or chilly, that was not power. That was panic. They were really overwhelmed by how you made them feel. Instead of facing it, they chose to fight. That way, they could remain close to you without ever revealing why they wanted to be there. Conflict became a type of closeness. It was the only way they could feel something for you without giving in to it. The louder they became, the more they attempted to drown out the truth. They saw you, wanted you, and possibly even loved you, but they didn't trust themselves enough to say it. So they utilized drama to remain in the room. There is no affection, no communication, and no honesty, only emotional noise. People like that don't know how to ask for intimacy. They only know how to cause havoc around the people they care most about. It's reversed, but it's real. Their attacks were not simply reactions. These were confessions, not in words, but in behavior. And every fight, every collision, every strange energy transfer, that was them saying, "You got under my skin. I just don't know how to say it without burning everything down." Sixth, they clashed because they were competing for a piece of you. They were not simply clashing because they disagreed. They were clashing because they were possessive, and neither one wanted to admit it out loud. You became the unspoken prize in a game no one was willing to confess they were playing. The tension, the passive-aggressive digs, and the uneasy energy when you entered the room were all based on one simple truth. They wanted a piece of you and couldn't bear the idea that someone else might have more. You did not offer yourself as a trophy. You weren't trying to be desirable, but it didn't matter. You symbolized something uncommon: presence, attention, and emotional depth. People who are emotionally starving will struggle for scraps of that, even if they claim to be above it, especially when they seem to be above it. This was not about love in the poetic sense. This was about control, ownership, and a warped type of attachment that said, if I can't fully have you, I'll make sure no one else does either. That's why you could have noticed people responding strangely when you showed kindness to someone else, or laughed too heartily at the incorrect person's joke. Suddenly there's tension, side comments, emotional withdrawal, all tactics in a silent war. They never asked your permission to fight. They never admitted they cared because that would have made them vulnerable. Instead, they turned it into a competition. One-upmanship, subtle rivalry, and side-eye disguised as concern. And the craziest part is that they weren't fighting over a relationship. They were fighting over access to you, the feeling of being chosen, seen, and preferred, and the idea of belonging to you in a way that others didn't. You didn't sign up for the drama, but they dragged you into it anyway, because when people crave someone they can't fully possess, connection becomes combat. And what appears to be drama on the surface is often just desperation in disguise. People fighting to feel significant in your story, even if it means going to war. Number 7. You represented the choice they didn't make. You didn't offend them. You exposed them by simply existing the way you do, boldly, unapologetically, and without waiting for permission. You lived your truth out loud, and that alone reminded them of every time they played small, every time they said no when life asked them to say yes, every opportunity they passed up, every risk they talked themselves out of, and every part of themselves they silenced to keep things safe. You were living proof that it was always possible to choose differently. That's why they couldn't look at you without flinching, because you're more than just a person in their life. You're a living, breathing reminder of the life they could have had if fear hadn't won, the version of themselves they secretly wished to be, but never committed to. It wasn't just jealousy, it was regret. When they saw you grow, thrive, fall, and rise again, it shattered the lie they used to justify staying stuck, because they know that the only thing that separates them from where you are is courage. They had convinced themselves that comfort was the smart choice, that stability and predictability were the best options. Not because you made them feel less, but because you made them realize they could have been more. And when people can't forgive themselves for squandering their own potential, they begin to resent anyone who doesn't. So they weren't just being distant, moody, or going through a difficult time. They were hurting in silence, not because of you, but because you unintentionally revealed that they had a choice, and they didn't take it. You didn't hurt them. It was their unchosen potential that did. You simply resurrected it. Number 8. Their fear was stronger than their love for you. They felt something genuine for you, something deep, something that shook them in ways they didn't know how to deal with. But instead of leaning into it, they backed away. Not because you weren't worth it, not because the connection wasn't there, but because fear was louder than love, and fear always wins in their world. You arrived with clarity. You showed them something genuine, something safe yet exciting, but it scared them more than any toxic relationship or dead-end situation they'd ever been in. Because what you offered wasn't just attention, but emotional truth, which is dangerous for people who have built their identity on survival mode. You threatened them, not in a harmful way, but in a way that said, "You don't have to live like this anymore." It requires honesty, presence, openness, all of the things they've been trained to avoid. They stayed loyal to what they knew: fear, distance, control, half connection. And that terrified them because if they accepted what you were offering, it meant unlearning everything they thought kept them safe. You became the unfamiliar freedom they didn't know how to trust, and instead of rising to meet it, they shrunk back into the cage they decorated as a life. They knew it was small. They knew it wasn't love, but it was predictable, and it didn't ask them to change. So they chose fear, not because it felt better, but because it felt familiar. And in doing so, they lost you. They couldn't meet you in truth because they never learned how to stand on their own. When you were chosen, it wasn't just a simple decision. It was a seismic shift in the invisible social order they'd been relying on to feel safe and important. Their silence wasn't peace. It was surrender, not to you, but to everything they were too afraid to let go of. You weren't just liked or noticed. You were elevated. People get comfortable with their place in the pecking order, the roles they play, the attention they get, and the unspoken respect they command. But you upset all of that. You were chosen through their carefully balanced world into chaos, which is terrifying. Suddenly the spotlight was on you, and others who expected to be seen instead found themselves in the shadows. This shift made them uncomfortable, not because you deserved less or more attention, but because it forced them to confront their own insecurities about status and worth. They felt invisible in a way they hadn't before. When they clashed, it was a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of power that felt stolen, and instead of dealing with those feelings honestly, they lashed out. They wanted to bring you down to their level rather than rise to meet yours because admitting your rise meant admitting their fall, which is a difficult reality to accept. Being chosen made you a threat to the unspoken hierarchy they relied on. Your presence questioned the old rules, the subtle agreements that dictated who mattered and who didn't. You challenged their idea of what success, affection, and loyalty looked like, and they weren't ready to rewrite the script. They saw your elevation as a disruption, an upheaval of the status quo. So they fought back, not because you weren't worthy, but because the system they thrived in was suddenly unstable. You represented a new order, one where genuine connection and truth mattered more than appearances and control, and that terrified them more than they ever wanted to admit. They hid their feelings to protect themselves, not to be kind or to shield you from pain. Their silence was a defense mechanism built brick by brick to protect their fragile sense of self. Being around you meant risking everything they'd worked so hard to keep hidden. When you showed up, they felt vulnerable, insecure, and exposed in unexpected ways. Your presence peeled back layers they kept tightly sealed, revealing wounds and desires they didn't want to face. They were afraid of being rejected, judged, or abandoned, so they armored themselves with coldness, distance, or fake indifference. This wasn't a lack of feelings. Rather, it was evidence of how deeply they cared, but didn't know how to express it without losing control. Showing affection meant stepping into unknown territory where they might lose their footing and be perceived as weak or needy, roles they weren't prepared to play. So they chose to pretend not to care, hoping that by concealing their true emotions, they could maintain their identity as someone strong, independent, and untouchable. In reality, every bit of that coldness was a scream for safety, a way to keep themselves from drowning in feelings they hadn't learned to navigate. They weren't protecting you, and they were desperately protecting themselves from the chaos that love and truth can bring. They built walls around their hearts, not to keep you out, but to keep their own fears locked in. When they pushed you away or acted indifferent, it wasn't because you weren't worthy of love. It was because they were terrified of what love might ask of them. Number 11. They fought over you because you were the unclaimed prize in their inner war. You weren't just a person to them. You were the unclaimed prize in a struggle raging within their own hearts. They weren't fighting to possess you as an object or a conquest. They were wrestling with the parts of themselves that you unknowingly awakened. You embodied everything they wished for: the hope of change, the chance to heal old wounds, the possibility of becoming better. But reaching for you meant confronting the shadows they'd been running from for years, which none of them wanted to acknowledge. But the conflict wasn't really about you. It was about their own inner conflict, the fight between who they were and who they wished they could be. You held up a mirror to their unfinished selves, and that made them restless, confused, and desperate. They wanted to claim you, not just have you, but the version of themselves they saw reflected in your light. To truly reach you, they'd have to confront their own fears, regrets, and insecurities, which is difficult. It's much easier to fight over you, to wrestle in the chaos, than to do the quiet, painful work of self-confrontation. So they turned their longing into rivalry, desire into conflict, and hope into a battlefield. The clash wasn't just noise. It was a raw, unspoken expression of their own brokenness and yearning. You became the prize, but also the trigger. The more they fought over you, the more they fought against themselves, and the war would continue until they learned to face their own ghosts. You were caught in the middle, a symbol of what they both desired and feared to become. Number 12. You didn't fit into their story. You rewrote it. They had a script in their heads, a story that made sense to them, with clear roles, predictable outcomes, and comfortable illusions. You were supposed to fit into a specific place in that story: the familiar, the expected, the safe. But you didn't. You stepped into their lives and tore up the pages they thought they controlled. You rewrote the narrative in ways they hadn't prepared for, which scared them more than any obvious betrayal could. It wasn't about what you did, but who you became, and you refused to be a bystander in someone else's story. You refused to play the part they assigned you, whether it was the quiet one, the easy option, or the background noise. Instead, you claimed the role of the author, the one who shapes the story, changes the plot, and challenges the status quo. They were not prepared for that kind of power shift. They were comfortable with their version of the story because it allowed them to control the narrative, keep emotions predictable, and avoid messy truths. Suddenly, their neat little world felt uncertain, chaotic, and out of control. They wanted the character they knew, the version of you that fit their expectations, not the bold, unpredictable person rewriting the entire script. So, their conflict with you was a fight to keep the old story going, to keep you playing the role they'd written. But you weren't a character. You were the author, so you weren't just changing the plot. You were challenging their entire worldview. In their discomfort, they lashed out, resisted, and pushed back because confronting the new story meant confronting themselves, which is always the most difficult part. Number 13. You exposed their emotional illiteracy. They felt something real for you, something that shook them to their core. but they couldn't put it into words, couldn't even fully understand it themselves. Their emotions were a tangled mess, raw and confusing, and they had no map to navigate through that storm. Instead of confronting those feelings head-on, they resorted to what felt familiar: chaos. They didn't know how to say, "I care," "I'm afraid," or "I want to be closer." Vulnerability was foreign territory, and admitting their emotions felt like giving up power. They weren't prepared to lose, so their fear and frustration spilled out as conflict, distance, or aggression. The clash wasn't just about disagreement or dislike. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to communicate what they couldn't say. Their emotional illiteracy turned what could have been connection into destruction. Instead of building bridges, they burned them. Instead of honesty, they offered hostility. They lacked the tools, words, emotional insight, and courage to handle their intense feelings for you. So, the whole thing spiraled into fights, mixed signals, and confusion. It wasn't a lack of feeling. It was a lack of language and maturity. You became the teacher in their chaos, exposing just how unprepared they were to handle real emotion. Instead of stepping up, they stepped back, choosing to fight the feelings rather than confront them. In the end, the battles were not about you, but about their incapacity to fully connect, express, and evolve. Destruction became easier than expression because it was the only way they knew how to hold the anguish at bay. Number 14. Your light was a threat to their darkness, so they sought to dampen it. When you shine brightly, it forces others to confront their own darkness, the parts of themselves they've hidden away, ignored, or refused to heal. Your light doesn't just illuminate your path, it casts long shadows on theirs, exposing the cracks they desperately want to keep covered. This isn't about you being too much. It's about their fear of confronting what they've buried deep inside themselves. The clash that erupted wasn't a personal attack. It was primal survival instinct kicking in. When someone hasn't done their own inner work, when they're still tangled in old wounds and unhealed pain, seeing someone else whole and vibrant feels like a threat. It's as if your wholeness shines a light on their fractures, making their unresolved struggles impossible to ignore. Rather than being inspired or motivated to heal alongside you, they reacted defensively, turning their fear into aggression, jealousy, or withdrawal, always attempting to dim your light so they wouldn't feel so exposed. It's easier to drag someone down into your undoing than to face the difficult truth of your own brokenness. They tried to pull you into their chaos because in their minds, if you're not shining, you're safe from judgment, comparison, and the painful reminder of what's missing in their own lives. Your growth threatened their comfort zone, so they clung to the familiar darkness, even if it meant clinging to you. This kind of conflict isn't about love or hate. It's about fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of change. Your light was never the problem. It was their inability to face their own shadows. Until they choose healing, they'll keep attempting to dim the brilliance they secretly envy. It's easier to fight the light than to become it. You didn't just disrupt their world. You awakened parts of them they've struggled to face. At the heart of every conflict over you is a truth far more complex than simple rivalry or jealousy. A raw, tangled mix of fear, longing, and unspoken vulnerability. A mirror reflecting not just who they are, but who they've refused to become. And while that awakening sparked conflict, it also carried the potential for profound growth if they ever found the courage to stop fighting you and start fighting their own shadows instead. You weren't the problem. You were the catalyst, the living proof that change is possible, that light can't be dimmed without a fight, and that true connection requires bravery, rather than silence or chaos. Remember this: being chosen, being the center of such fierce emotions, means that you are rare, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Their clashes, attacks, and defenses are not about your worth, but about their own limitations. So stand tall, unshaken by the storms they stir. Their battles are theirs to fight, but your journey is yours to own. You embody a truth that cannot be silenced, the truth that to be fully alive is to be seen, even if it's uncomfortable, and in that you hold a power far greater than any clash, the power to inspire transformation beginning with yourself. If this resonated with you and you want to delve deeper into these truths, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of real talk. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and leave a comment below to share your own experiences or opinions. We'd love to hear your story, and don't forget to share it with someone who could benefit from it as well. Thank you for being here, for being